Section 338. Write that number down somewhere because most Canadians have never heard it. Most Americans have never heard it. And until this week, almost nobody in Washington had used it in nearly a century. And yet on Monday, it became the single most important phrase in the entire Canada-United States relationship because Donald Trump just reached back 96 years into a dusty corner of American law to slap a 50% tariff on Canadian goods. And the Prime Minister of Canada stood up and said flatly that it breaks every rule the two countries agreed to. Let me drop you right into the middle of this because the details matter more than the headline lets on. On July 20th, the President signed an order placing a 50% tariff on a whole shelf of Canadian products. Not 5%, not 15, 50. And it isn't limited to steel or aluminum this time, the usual suspects. This list hits things that sound almost absurd when you say them out loud. Canadian wine, cement, and I promise you, I am not making this up, hockey sticks, the one product on Earth that might as well have a maple leaf stamped into its DNA, and it's now sitting on an American tariff list at a 50% markup. But the product list isn't the shocking part. The shocking part is how he did it because to reach a number that big, that fast, Trump didn't use the tariff tools everyone has spent the last year and a half arguing about. He skipped the national security route. He skipped the emergency economic powers everybody expected. Instead, his order cites something called Section 338 of the Tariff Act of 1930. 1930? Sit with that for a second. That law is older than the modern trade system. It is older than the World Trade Organization. It is older than NAFTA, older than its replacement, older than nearly every rule that governs how these two economies do business today. It was written in an America that didn't have highways coast to coast in a year the Great Depression was just beginning to bite, and Trump just pulled it off the shelf, blew the dust off it, and pointed it directly at Ottawa. If you live here in Toronto, in Halifax, in Saskatoon, anywhere in this country, I need you to understand why a 96-year-old paragraph of American law suddenly decides what your groceries cost, what your job looks like, and whether the single most important trade agreement Canada has is worth the paper it's printed on. Because that's what's actually on the table here, not hockey sticks, leverage, and the question of who is even allowed to make the rules anymore. Now, here's where it gets interesting, and here's the part I had to read 3 times before it clicked. Section 338 was never meant to be a normal tariff tool. Read the actual language, and it's almost startling how specific it is. It gives the American president the power to hit another country with tariffs of up to 50% when that country is judged to be discriminating against United States commerce. 50% right there, written into the statute as the ceiling. That is not a coincidence. Trump didn't land on 50 because it felt tough. He landed on 50 because that is the exact maximum the 1930 law allows him to reach without going through Congress at all. And that word, discriminating, is the whole game. Because to make Section 338 work, the White House has to argue that Canada has been unfairly targeting American business. And what do you think they're pointing at? The retaliation, the counter tariffs Canada put up, the provincial liquor boards that pulled American wine and spirits off the shelves, the very acts of self-defense that Canada took in response to the last round of tariffs are now being reframed by Washington as the crime that justifies the next round. Think about the logic there because it's important. Canada gets hit. Canada pushes back. And then that pushback gets used as the legal excuse to hit Canada even harder with a bigger number under an older law. It's a snake eating its own tail. And it tells you exactly what kind of fight this is. This isn't about balancing trade. This is about making sure that every move Canada makes to protect itself can be turned into ammunition against it. Before I get to how Carney answered, and his answer was sharper and more strategic than most of the coverage gave him credit for, you need to understand why this specific legal choice is so dangerous, because the tool tells you the intent. When Trump used national security justifications in the past, there was at least a process, investigations, reports, comment periods, slow-moving machinery that gave Canada room to respond, to lobby, to litigate. Section 338 is different. It's fast. It's built to be a presidential lever, something the White House can pull with far less of that machinery in the way. By choosing this path, Trump wasn't just picking a bigger number. He was picking the route with the fewest speed bumps. He wanted this to land quickly and land hard, and he wanted Canada to feel like the ground had shifted before anyone could brace for it. And here's the detail almost nobody is leading with. This same law, Section 338, has essentially sat unused for generations. It's one of those provisions legal scholars point to as a museum piece, a relic from a more protectionist age that everyone assumed was effectively dead. Reviving it isn't just aggressive, it's a signal. It says the president is willing to go digging through the archives, past every modern agreement, to find whatever gives him the widest possible swing. When you have to reach back to 1930 to justify what you're doing in 2026, that tells you something about how the present-day rules actually see your case. So, that's the setup. A revived Depression-era law, a 50% wall, and a product list that reads like someone went out of their way to hit Canada where it hurts culturally as well as economically. Now, let's talk about how Ottawa answered, because this is where the story stops being about Trump and starts being about strategy. Mark Carney's response came the next day on July 21st, and I want to be precise about what he said because the wording was deliberate. He called the new tariffs a direct violation of the Continental Trade Agreement, CUSMA, the deal that is supposed to govern exactly this kind of thing. A direct violation, not a concern, not an irritant, a violation. He is saying in plain language that the United States has broken the rules of the very agreement it signed. And then he did something that on the surface looks like a contradiction, but underneath is the whole strategy. In the same breath that he accused Washington of breaking the deal, he signaled that Canada is open to intensified trade talks. He didn't slam the door. He held it open while pointing at the person who kicked it. Now, a lot of people are going to read that as weakness. Carney getting hit with a 50% tariff and immediately offering to talk, isn't that exactly the blinking everyone keeps waiting for? Stay with me, because I think that reading gets it backwards. And the reason why is the most important thing in this entire video. Here's what Carney is actually doing. By calling it a direct violation of CUSMA, he's not just venting, he's laying down a legal and diplomatic marker. He's putting on the record in front of the whole world that it was the United States that broke the agreement first using a law from before that agreement existed. That matters enormously because trade disputes aren't won only in the moment. They're won in the paper trail. Every other country watching this, every future arbitration panel, every ally deciding whether Washington is a reliable partner, is now looking at a Canadian Prime Minister who said clearly, calmly, and on the record, "We followed the rules, and they didn't." And by keeping the door open to talks at the same time, he denies Trump the one thing an escalation like this is designed to produce. Trump wants Canada to either fold or to blow up and walk away because either one gives him a story. Fold and he wins. Storm off and he gets to say, Canada was never serious about a deal. Carney is refusing to give him either. He's saying essentially, you broke the rules and I'm still willing to sit at the table. So now the pressure is on you to explain why you won't. That's not weakness. That's flipping the burden of proof onto Washington in front of an audience. But let me be honest with you, because being straight about the hard parts is the whole point of this channel. This is a genuinely dangerous moment for Canada, and the very lowest point language that analysts are using is not hype. On July 21st, the read from Trade Watchers was blunt. Canada-United States relations are now sitting at the lowest point they've seen, and that's not just mood setting. When a 50% tariff lands on real products, real people feel it. A winery that ships south, a cement plant that supplies American construction, the workers who make those hockey sticks. These are jobs, shifts, invoices, families. When you strip away the geopolitics, a tariff is a tax and somebody always ends up paying it. So the question you should be asking is the one that actually determines who wins this standoff. Does Canada have anywhere else to go? Because if answer is no, then Carney's calm is a bluff, and 50% will eventually force a fold. But if the answer is yes, then this is a very different picture, and Washington may have just made a serious miscalculation. And here's where the numbers that nobody's putting front and center start to matter. For decades, Canada's entire economic story has been built around one customer. Roughly 3/4 of everything this country exports has gone to the United States. That kind of dependence is normally a chokehold. It's the reason a 50% tariff is supposed to bring Canada to its knees. When one buyer takes that much of what you sell, they get to set the terms, and everyone knows it. But watch what's been quietly happening underneath the headlines. That dependence has been sliding. Canada has spent the last stretch deliberately widening its export base, chasing buyers that aren't Washington, building the kind of relationships that a 50% tariff can't touch. It's slow, it's unglamorous, and it doesn't happen overnight. But it changes the math, because the entire threat behind Section 338 rests on one assumption, that Canada has nowhere else to sell. Every percentage point that assumption weakens, the weaker the 50% wall becomes as a weapon. A tariff only works if you can't root around it, and Canada has been building the off-ramps. That's the context Carney is operating inside, and it's why he can call it a direct violation and still keep his voice level. He's not bluffing from an empty hand. He's playing a longer game where every month of diversification makes the next threat land a little softer. Now, here's a piece that most coverage is treating as a separate story, and I think that's a mistake, because when you put it next to the tariff news, it changes the whole flavor. On that exact same day, July 21st, the United States and Mexico sat down for a third round of talks to renegotiate the Continental Trade Agreement. The same agreement Trump is accused of violating against Canada. So, at the very moment Washington is hammering one North American partner with a Depression-era law, it's calmly working through the details with the other. Think about what that tells you. This is not a story about America rejecting the whole idea of continental trade. Mexico is right there at the table. This is a story about Canada specifically being singled out, isolated, pulled aside, and pressured, while the machinery of North American trade keeps turning next door. That's a deliberate choice, and it's meant to make Canada feel alone, to make Ottawa feel like the odd one out that had better get in line before it gets left behind entirely. But there's a flip side to being singled out, and Carney clearly sees it. If the United States is willing to break the rules with one partner while negotiating in good faith with another, then it isn't the rules that are the problem. It's the target. And that undercuts every principled justification Washington might offer. You can't argue you're defending fair trade in a room in 1 hour and reviving a 1930 discrimination statute against your northern neighbor in the next. The inconsistency is the tell. It says, this was never about principle. It was about who Trump decided to squeeze. So let me pull the threads together, because when you line them all up, the picture is much clearer than the noise suggests. Trump reached back to 1930 because the modern rules don't give him the swing he wanted. He picked 50% because that's the ceiling that old law allows. He targeted products with cultural sting because pain and symbolism travel further than economics alone. And he did it to Canada specifically while keeping the door open with Mexico, because Canada is the partner he's decided to isolate. And on the other side, Carney called it exactly what it is, a direct violation, put that on the record for the whole world, and then refused to either fold or flee, keeping the door to talks open so that the burden of explaining this mess sits on Washington instead of Ottawa. Behind him is a slow, unfinished but real shift in where Canada actually sells its goods. which is the one thing that turns a 50% threat from a knockout blow into something Canada can absorb and outlast. I'm not going to pretend this is comfortable. It isn't. The lowest point in the relationship is a real description, not a figure of speech, and there will be businesses and workers who feel this before any of the diplomacy pays off. But the thing I keep coming back to is this. When a country has to dig up a law from the year before the Empire State Building even opened to justify what it's doing, that's not the move of a side that's confident in the present-day rules. That's the move of a side that knows the current rules don't back its case. And Carney, for all the pressure on him, understands that the paper trail he's building today is what the rest of the world will read tomorrow. Here's the question I want to leave you with, and I genuinely want your take in the comments. Do you think Carney's approach, calling it a violation while keeping the door open, is the smart long game? Or is it the kind of restraint that eventually gets read as weakness under a 50% wall? Because that's the debate that's going to define the next stretch of this fight. And where you land probably says a lot about how you think leverage really works between a giant and its neighbor. If you want to keep following this the way I try to cover it here, with the actual laws, the actual numbers, and the honest limits laid out next to the real strengths, subscribe to Laura Hayes' Point. Because this Section 338 story is not a one-day headline. It's the opening move in something that's going to run for a long time, and I'll be tracking every step of it with you. I'll say one more thing before I go, because I think it's the part that's easy to miss in all of this. A tariff is a number, but the story underneath a tariff is always about power. Who has options? Who has allies? Who has somewhere else to go when the biggest partner turns hostile? For most of its history, Canada answered those questions with a shrug, because there was only ever one real answer, and it lived to the south. What makes this moment different? What makes it worth watching so closely is that for the first time in a long time, those answers are actually starting to change. Not fast enough to make this painless, but maybe fast enough to change who blinks first. And that, more than any single hockey stick on a tariff list, is the thing I'll be keeping my eye on. So, tell me what you think below. Share this with someone who still believes it's just about wine and cement, and I'll see you in the next one.